Hey guys, I'm back, and now I'm ready to finish off this Prime Ministers in the Spotlight series. Today, we get to talk about two of the greatest Prime Ministers who ever lived, as well as some other random guys nobody talks about. So without further ado, let's read the defences of Australia as I look into the Prime Ministers who led us through World War II. Now a reminder before we begin that videos like these are brought to you by my lovely patrons like Thomas Johnson, James Rapp, Mike Rand, Cameron Strauss, Rudbot, Tom Smarty, Edward Peer, Jezza, and a special mention to ARW for their contribution to today's video. For as little as $3 Australian a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Stormon video as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content, link in the description below. ARW says, John Curtin's leadership was completely consumed by the war effort, and shortly after becoming Prime Minister in late 1941, he was confronted with the entry of Japan into the war. Within a matter of months, Japan had conquered most of Southeast Asia, expanding right up to the Dutch East Indies and New Guinea, to Australia's immediate north by early 1942. Most crucially, the British surrender of Singapore in February 1942 completely upturned Australia's long-term strategy of relying on British naval power for its external defence. Curtin was crucial in redirecting Australia's forces to the war against Japan, allowing the United States to play the leading role in the Pacific theatre, with Australia as a base. These events signified the beginning of Australia's long-term alliance with the United States, with Curtin's close relationship with Supreme Commander Douglas MacArthur presaging close relations between the future leaders of both countries. By the end of 1942, key naval victories against Japan had lessened the threat of an invasion of Australia, allowing Curtin to implement domestic policies which expanded the role of the federal government to an unprecedented degree. Most notably in the provisions of social services and centralising Australia's taxation regimes, so the majority of taxes would be collected by the federal government as opposed to the states. Curtin's reforms proved popular, allowing him to win the 1943 election in a landslide and to spend much of 1944 overseas. Tragically, Curtin would suffer a heart attack in late 1944 and his health would decline to his eventual death in mid-1945. By this stage, the war was nearly over. The foundations for Australia's post-war future were in place, and the Labor Party had never been in a stronger position. He continues to be held in great esteem not just by the Labor Party, but in Australian history more generally, and he is rightly regarded as one of Australia's greatest ever Prime Ministers. And now for my take. Firaxis Games very much made the right decision when they chose to have John Curtin lead Australia in Civilization 6. Curtin is a much beloved figure not just in the Labor Party ranks but the wider public as well. Being the man who led Australia through its darkest moment with Japan's forces right on the nation's doorstep really elevated Curtin to high esteem. However, Curtin's legacy goes well beyond World War II as his economic reforms back in Australia gave birth to multiple social services that we take for granted today. It's a shame Curtin never got to lead a country at peace, as this task will be taken over by his successor. However, we first need to talk about our shortest serving Prime Minister. ARW says, Frank Ford has the unfortunate title of Australia's shortest serving Prime Minister, serving as interim Prime Minister following Curtin's death. Ford contested the ballot that was held 7 days later and did have a strong claim to leadership, having been deputy leader under both Scullin and Curtin and nearly becoming Labor leader in 1935, in which he lost by 1 vote to Curtin. He served as Minister for the Army throughout Curtin's government and was heavily involved with the deployment of Australia's forces overseas. By 1945, however, Curtin's treasurer Ben Shipley had grown in stature and easily defeated Ford in the ballot. In a sign of good character, Ford did not raise any complaints and continued as a loyal deputy to Shipley as he had for a decade under Curtin. He continued as Army Minister, though when the war ended, Ford was blamed for the slow demobilisation of Australia's overseas personnel and unexpectedly lost his seat in the 1946 election. Ford would serve as High Commissioner to Canada and later in Queensland politics well into the 1950s before retiring in the 1960s, outliving both Curtin and Shipley by several decades. And now for my take. Ford is quite often the forgotten figure of Labour's wartime leaders. To most, he is nothing more than the answer to the trivia question of who is the shortest serving Prime Minister. However, Ford's tenure as minister both predated and went well beyond his fellow World War II leaders. Elected in 1922, Ford would be the only one of the three to serve as a minister in Scullin's Depression government, and was also the only one of the three not to lose his seat in 1931. He would also outlive both of them by 3 whole decades, only passing away shortly before Bob Hawke became Prime Minister. ARW says, If there is one Prime Minister in Australia's history who embodies the Australian dream, it's Ben Shipley. Born and raised in Bathurst, New South Wales during the 1890s Depression, and with little formal education, Shipley started his career as a train driver before becoming involved in union and labour politics throughout the 1910s and 20s. He was initially elected to federal parliament in 1929 but lost his seat in 1931, and then spent the rest of the 1930s battling Jack Lang's forces within the New South Wales Labour Party, as well as serving on the Royal Commission into the banking industry in the mid-1930s. Shipley would return to Parliament in 1940 and become Treasurer when John Curtin became Prime Minister in late 1941. Shipley's performance as Treasurer was widely lauded as he easily won the ballot to become Leader and Prime Minister following Curtin's death in July 1945. Japan's surrender in August 1945 brought the Second World War to a close, and Shipley moved quickly to provide the foundations for Australia's post-war growth. In addition to continuing the provisions of social services spearheaded by the Curtin government, Shipley introduced the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, provided a sophisticated regime of employment, education and training opportunities for returned soldiers, oversaw the beginning of Australia's post-war immigration schemes, and many other initiatives. Shipley easily won re-election for Labour in 1946, and his overall legislative record remains one of the most extensive of any Australian Prime Ministers. Shipley's time in power came to an end in 1949, however, with two decisions that made his final term contribute heavily to Labour's defeat by the coalition. First, his attempt in 1947 to nationalise the banks. This gave the opposition a clear line of attack on the government that was made more potent by the early Cold War fears of communism in the Australian community. In addition to the natural opposition from the banks themselves and broader business community, Shipley's decision to maintain wartime rationings of everyday goods well after the war's conclusion also proved unpopular, and Menzies' promise to relax these controls also contributed to Shipley's government's defeat. Despite these blemishes, Shipley still stands as one of Australia's most outstanding Prime Ministers and provides the foundation for Australia's continued growth and prosperity into the 1950s and beyond. And finally, for my take. I can easily see why Shipley is regarded as one of the best Prime Ministers we ever had. He is held by many academics as one of, if not the best Treasurer we ever had, and in some respects he represented what Curtin could have been had he lived to see the end of World War II. His post-war policies in most respects set Australia up for the boom years it would experience throughout the 1950s. However, Shipley's idealistic policies would in some respects be his downfall. While I somewhat supported his moves to nationalise the banks and keep wartime rationing policies, they were never going to be politically popular, and had Shipley been less dogmatic with these policies, he might have kept Labour in power during the 1949 election. And with that, we've covered the wartime Prime Ministers of John Curtin, Frank Ford and Ben Shipley. Next time I'll be back to talk about the last of the historic Prime Ministers, when I dive in and talk about the Prime Ministers of the 1950s/60s coalition government. So please leave your comments on Robert Menzies, Harold Holt, John McEwen, John Gordon and William McMahon if you want to see them featured in my next video. Until then, I'll see you later.